From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Ted Nisi. Tim White is off on assignment today. We're going to have a political roundtable this week discussing the big topics in the news this past week, state and federal, and there is no lack of topics to discuss. So joining me for this week's discussion, my colleague Dan McGowan, WPRI.com Providence City Hall reporter. Ian Donnis, he is political reporter at Rhode Island Public Radio and longtime member of the stabling summer stock here at Newsmakers. Also on the panel, John Marion, he is the executive director of Common Cause Rhode Island, and June Speakman, she is a political science professor at Roger Williams University. Everybody, thanks for being here this week, and let's dive right in. I want to start with a story Tim and I have actually been looking into for more than a week now, which is this strange saga of Cranston's top developer, the Carpianato Group, giving free rent to political campaign headquarters. First, we noted irregularities in Republican Alan Fung's filings, which showed he had gotten what were reported as refunds. They now say they just didn't cash our checks. Other campaigns saying they're also paying below market there. But then we found out this week that the Cranston Democratic City Committee, run by Michael Seepy, also says they never got a bill for their headquarters in 2014. John, you filed a complaint just about the Fung things that came out initially with Carpianato. You added to that complaint the Cranston Democrats. Not to belabor the obvious, but why did you think this was worth a complaint to the Board of Elections?
Sure. So we filed a complaint with the Board of Elections alleging violations by Fung, by the Cranston Democratic City Committee, as well as by Carpianato. So not just the receiver of the discount, but the giver. And those were focused on the rent, specifically in some instances free rent for the party and Fung in the 2016 cycle, as well as discounted rent currently by Fung, and as well as in 2014. You can't give a discount because somebody's a politician if you're a business. That's called an in-kind contribution that's not at fair market value. As well as corporations can't give to candidates. A lot of people remember Citizens United. Corporations can spend in elections, but they can't give directly to candidates. And even rent is something, it's a gift to a candidate. So a lot of this behavior, at least on the surface, looks illegal.
At the Board of Elections, when a complaint is filed, it is private. So it's not like a trial or something that there's opening statements happen in public or something like that. What do you expect happens from here? You filed your complaint. There were also complaints filed by Fung's rivals who have their own reasons to file a complaint. Where do you think it goes from here?
Yeah, so they will, in executive or closed session, decide whether they're going to investigate. The facts are pretty clear. I think they'll investigate. That'll probably happen next week when they have a meeting. And then we won't hear about it for a couple of months because it will all happen behind closed doors. If they find a violation, they will come out and announce what they did. If they don't find violations, they'll never tell us what happened with the investigation. That all remains sealed.
Dan, I want to ask you, you don't cover Cranston City Hall, but you cover Providence City Hall. Carpianato, the biggest developer in Cranston and a major force all over the place. Talk about why developers care so much about the political process.
Yeah, so if you think about it, leading into election seasons, things like that, you don't see developers very often getting involved in the nitty-gritty races, right? They're not funding, they're not door knocking for people. Once the election season ends, the most influential people in municipal government tend to be the developers. Why? Because they're the ones that create jobs and want to build, and politicians generally don't want to be considered anti-development, right? And so whenever you see, think about all the things that developers need to get things done. Tax breaks, zoning changes, all these things. It takes, usually they have very good lawyers and lobbyists, and so they know how to get through processes, and so they have to go in front of committees and councils and all that stuff, but they're they are by far the most influential special interest group, and you see it everywhere. You see the big ones, Carpianato, certainly Joe Palino, Buff Chase, guys like that who are are always around and always building, and that's why.
And they want to make sure they have friends on both sides of the aisle, at least when political control is split.
Absolutely.
Ian, you started looking into this too this week, and you had an interesting story about Carpianato's involvement in Cranston politics. What did you find?
Well, speaking of both sides of the aisle, I found a campaign mailer from 2016 that endorsed both Cranston Mayor Alan Fung and the Democratic House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello. It's rare to see a mailer going out supporting both a Democrat and a Republican. It does reflect how Carpianato helped to pay for this mailer along with two other businesses in Cranston. It was sent out under a group under the aegis, oddly enough, of the head of the Correctional Officers Union. So there are a lot of strands here. But I think,
so to be clear, your reporting shows the correctional officers raised the money from Carpianato and other companies to have a mailer to endorse the Republican mayor and the Democratic speaker.
That's correct. And the bottom line here is that it's another instance in which the Carpianato group was involved in the political process in Cranston. As Dan said, it's rare to see developers active in campaign season, but here was an example of that.
June, I'm going to give you the last word on this before we move on. You watch politics at all levels and zoom out as an academic. With this sort of story, how much do you think these sorts of things resonate, make an impact with voters, and how much do people say, that's politics?
Well, I think this particular story just falls into the frame of corruption in Rhode Island, which is something that bothers a lot of voters all the time, and it also, the frame that is by which Rhode Island is perceived from outside of the state is also that it's one of the most corrupt states in the country, and I think this just justifies that perception, right? And I think that we, in order for that perception to dissolve, these stories need to stop. But they won't. As you say, developers are important politicians are important to developers, so you're going to continue to see them play in politics.
And I presume you mean they have to stop happening, not we have to stop reporting them, right?
Correct, that is correct.
All right, let's move on to the General Assembly. So we are taping on Friday morning, as we always do. Last night, Speaker Mattiello threatened to keep the session going through to Saturday, so by the time most of you watch this on Sunday, Lord knows what will have happened. I would never hazard a guess. But we can talk a little about what's happening in the bigger themes of this year's session. And Ian, you've been up there a lot. I've been there with you at times, and you've been doing some reporting on your own on these things. I want to ask you about the pay equity bill, or the equal pay bill. This has been a big push on the progressive side of the Assembly. There was a debate Thursday that got pretty heated on the House floor. Talk us through that, what you saw and what you think it signifies.
Sure. As you say, Ted, it was a very sharp debate. Women's activists have maintained for a long time that women earn less on the dollar for men for the same amount of work. People on the other side of the issue say those figures are skewed by how mothers take some years out of the workforce, and that skews the findings. But this was a legislative push by Susan Donovan, a rep from Bristol, to try and make more requirements for wage equity. Along the way, business groups advocated against it, and some changes were made that really upset progressives, upset Donovan. She herself looked like she would have rather been getting a root canal than rather being part of this debate that was going on in the House Thursday night. And in the end, despite the really sharp debate, the legislation was overwhelmingly approved by the House, 66-9. That shows the power of the leadership. At the same time, it seems unlikely the bill may clear the Senate, and but the argument against this from progressives was that this would set back the cause of wage equity. Supporters said it was an incremental step forward.
And in the Senate, I believe the sponsor is influential Providence Senator Gail Golden, who will have some say over what moves through her chamber.
That's right.
June, much talk about this being in politics the year of the women. We've seen this huge surge in women candidates all over the country, including here in Rhode Island. As Ian says, I'm sensing from my inbox, from talking to lawmakers, rising frustration among both some of the female representatives. It was brought up to us that Teresa Tanzi's Sexual Harassment Commission, none of those bills had been getting a vote at this hour as we're taping today. And then some of the women's groups that are organized are not happy about how assemblies are handling their top parties. Do you think that will be an issue that carries forward and that is on voters' minds?
Yeah, saying that women's groups are not happy is an understatement. I would say I follow all all of them on Twitter and Facebook, and yesterday there was a lot of activity, a lot of anger, a lot of organizing as this was falling apart, or as the bill was changing in the House. I think that there are lots of women running who had not intended to run. That's the Trump effect intersecting with Rhode Island politics, and I do think the lack of progress on the Reproductive Health Care Act is very significant. Which
is the one that would codify Roe v. Wade in state law, regardless of a Supreme Court decision.
That's correct, and women's groups did a tremendous amount of work on that, and nothing happened. So I really do think that this is a big issue. And the filing deadline has not occurred yet, so all of this has happened before the filing deadline, and I wouldn't be surprised if you see women getting into races where we haven't seen them before.
Yeah, we should remind people, if you want to run for office, for any reason, whether those reasons, your own reasons, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, is when you have to go down to the canvassers and file.
On those filing forms, you can also run for your local Democratic town committee. So you may see women and progressives entering into those races and winning them because no one pays attention. They're way at the bottom of the ballot, and people don't actually think you can run for them. So I wouldn't be surprised that we see some changes at the grassroots level in party organizations.
It's going to be interesting to see. Yeah. John, you've been up at the General Assembly a number of years now with the work you do for Common Cause. The end of the session is always nuts. Kathy Gregg always tells me stories about crazy late nights in the 80s. She's been up there a long time. In your years now up there, has it gotten any? It's always the same drummer. They suspend the rules so the bills can fly out of committee right to the floor, like almost happened with POSOX last night. Has it gotten any better from a good government transparency perspective in your years?
So there's this one significant change, which is that the Speaker of the House, after going very late in the night when he was first made Speaker, decided they're not going past 10 o'clock. And we're seeing him keep to that promise year after year after year, and he deserves congratulations for that. That said, Rhode Island is somewhat unique among states that are part-time legislatures, where it doesn't have a drop-dead date. You must be done by this date. And so what you see is the Speaker saying, okay, we're looking at the 22nd, but now we're hearing maybe Saturday. They can kind of hold it over the membership of, don't you want to have your summer? Let's keep things moving along and let's get out of here. I would say this year feels a little different because the chaos started a little sooner. This whole week has felt a little unstable, where things are moving. They're holding committee hearings simultaneous with floor sessions in some instances. That's usually a last night of the session thing, and we've seen that the whole week.
No, throughout the week. Interesting. Ian, I hesitate to say too much right now about the POSOX stadium bill, only because last night the bill popped out of House Committee finally late, went to the floor, then the Speaker stopped the debate. It's supposed to restart later today. Maybe it'll have passed by the time this show airs, maybe not. But even if a bill passes in the next few days and gets through the Senate as well, we don't know yet that a stadium will be built, right?
That's right, Ted. There are questions. Would investors be interested in buying the bonds for the stadium? Mayor Grebian says he's optimistic they would, but he's not a financial analyst, and so there are questions about it. And one interesting thing to me is that Speaker Mattiello took a very cautious approach to the POSOX issue for a long time, perhaps feeling burned by how the issue happened with a Providence proposal in 2015, and here it is being hashed out in the final days of session. Contrast that to how the state Senate held many months of hearings, passed their own POSOX proposal in January, and to the average Rhode Islander who may not be following the process super closely, it looks like, once again, things are getting rammed through in the final rush of the session. That might not be the best way to do the public's business.
The radical idea that 48 hours should be spent on major legislation. I don't know. Right. Might be too much in this, maybe in a different era. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to switch to national politics and talk about the furor over immigration that's roiling the nation right now. Stick with us on Newsmakers. I'm Ted Nisi, filling in for Tim White. Joining me on the panel for a political roundtable this week, we have WPRI.com reporter Dan McGowan, Rhode Island Public Radio political reporter Ian Donnis, Roger Williams University politics professor June Speakman, and Common Cause Rhode Island Executive Director John Marion. June, we have to talk, of course, about the immigration debate this week. Debate, not even exactly the right word. Right. The Trump administration backed down, sort of, with an executive order on its family separation separation policy after this massive outcry.
Right.
You saw somewhat unusually even a number of congressional Republicans like Ted Cruz breaking with the administration as the heat got hotter on whether to stay with this. What lessons do you take away from this latest blow up during the Trump presidency?
Well, it's reminiscent of the discussion we just had about Rhode Island politics, right? Chaos here, chaos there. This is no way to run a government, right? The president is, he's deeply connected to his base, and his advisor Stephen Miller, I think, was the architect of this policy. And he's in his own bubble where he thought that somehow this separating children from their families would force action in Congress and would stop people from coming over the border. That's just, it's bad policy, it's immoral, it's inhumane. Now, how it's going to play politically, you just indicated, right? Republicans are pulling away from him, and for the first time, Trump has responded to a public outcry that didn't come from his base. So I think this is a significant moment, although I've said that before in this administration. This is it.
What
This
do
will
you
change
think,
things,
though,
right?
June? What do you think made this one different? That, if there's one thing we know about President Trump, he does not like to back down. He doesn't. He talks he doesn't hide it. He doesn't.
Yeah.
He thinks it shows weakness. He, in the end, felt he had to sign this executive order, pulling back on this policy. What made this different?
I think it was the television images of children, right? And
it resonated as an emotional issue, right? Because
Yeah.
everyone can relate to a child crying. And I question whether this will hurt Trump with his base. I don't suspect it will, but it is notable that he did backtrack on it.
Right. And of course, you can't necessarily win with just your base,
That's
especially
right.
if you see Democratic activism being as
and
high
he's got
as
to
it
think
is.
about congressional races, right? So this was devastating in that out there.
Dan, it's a national story, but there was no lack of local outcry on it. Mayor Diosa from Central Falls went down to the border. Congressman Cicilline, Congressman Kennedy were both down there. Governor Raimondo said the state would not put children who were separated into foster care prior to the executive order. Talk a little bit about how this is read. You cover a majority-minority city in Providence, and Mayor Lorza often speaks about immigrants. How is this affecting the place you cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one, Mayor Lorza has really kind of found his stride as an elected official on the immigration issue, right? Remember, first year in office, certainly, he was learning how to be a mayor in a world that he didn't understand, politics in a lot of ways. Trump gets elected, and I think Mayor Lorza really, came out in force on the immigration issue. He's the son of Guatemalan immigrants, has a really great personal story.
He himself was undocumented when he came to
his parents.
I remember him talking about that.
That's right. He remembers that, and he was born here, but his parents were, and then they were, they are now citizens. But I think in the city, generally, you don't see any opposition to anything that the sanctuary city type issue, right? So generally, all 15 members of the council are on board. You don't see a conservative voice on the council. You don't see
there's been a Republican on the council in what, 25 years?
Yeah, since '86 was the last time someone was elected.
Even longer,
So the year I was born, right? So and so I think it's one of those things. What the mayor's doing, and you can question maybe will it hurt him down the line statewide electorally, but he's really firming up his base. He's going to roll out next week municipal IDs, which he says is going to be to really try to attract people who don't have a physical license or things like that. He, I think, mentioned that during his the press conference with the governor. So that's going to be something he's going to continue to talk about this. And again, he gets to do it without it affecting his his status in the city.
So these would be Providence issued IDs that anybody who lives in the city could get?
Exactly. And think about it. New York City does this. I believe New Haven, Connecticut. There are a lot of cities that do this. And the idea, there are not going to be a lot of perks attached to it, but it will have your name on it. Potentially down the line, you can get your bus pass on it, things like that. So it's the idea being that for many folks who may not have an ID, not just undocumented folks, homeless people, elderly people, anyone, kids, right? And so the idea is to put that, but he's certainly framing it around the immigration issue.
John, Providence County, not just the city, immigration policy is all tied up with this U.S. Census dress rehearsal for the 2020 census that your group, I know, has been involved in. And we were hearing a lot of concerns when that was beginning, that the adding of a question about citizenship that the Trump administration has put forward, as well as broader concerns here, could reduce the willingness of a lot of folks, especially in minority communities, to respond to the census. What are you seeing so far in the folks who follow that?
Yeah, so for people who aren't familiar, they're testing the census in only one place in the United States. That's the real census will happen in 2020, but this test is happening in Providence, which is essentially Cranston in North Providence County. The Census Bureau is telling us that they've counted, it's 50.91% was the last number I heard, of households contacted have responded. They're almost 2/3 the way through that, so that's not a very good number, right?
Because they want 100%, right?
They want 100%, but for a test, they will say, less than 100% is okay because they're testing systems. But nonetheless, they budgeted zero monies for outreach, so we're not seeing a marketing campaign. You're not seeing signs on bus shelters and the sort of thing we hope to see in 2020. What we're hearing a little bit that immigrant communities aren't responding out of fear, right? The census is supposed to count everyone regardless of whether they're documented or not. That's the role. There's this issue nationally of this citizenship question, and that is putting some fear into people, and so they're not responding. How that plays out for 2020, we don't know, but there's huge things at stake for Rhode Island because there's a congressional district on the line, and roughly 1/3 of the state budget that passed this week has some census component to how the money is allocated from the federal government. So it's an incredibly important issue.
All right, let's turn back to Rhode Island politics. And Ian, I'm going to turn to you on that. Gina Raimondo, Governor Raimondo, she had some rough news cycles this month, I would say, particularly that craziness with the lawyer who didn't file the appeal in the state. That wound up being settled, but it was a lot of embarrassing headlines for her administration. Also with the strange saga of John Lewis not taking it back fully, but saying he wouldn't have endorsed her if he'd known Matt Brown was challenging her in the Democratic primary. What does it look like right now with Matt Brown's Democratic primary challenge? He has no problem attacking her. He's doing his best to find issues where she's exposed on the left. How does that look like it's developing to you?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, Ted, Matt Brown is trying to peel off support on Raimondo's left on issues like driver's licenses, campaign contributions, various issues. And it's really fascinating because he's being very aggressive, but he's been away for Rhode Island's political scene for a long time before this campaign, about 12 years. So how is his name recognition? Is his campaign resonating beyond a boisterous but perhaps small group of people on the left side of Rhode Island's political spectrum? I would suspect Raimondo's campaign is taking nothing for chance, taking Brown's primary challenge very seriously, but we're not going to know until there's polling data or until the September 12th primary how serious a threat it is. Certainly, Governor Raimondo has been plagued by less than stellar approval ratings. There might be a lot of independents or Democrats who would cast a protest vote against her on the primary. The question is, how big is that level of support for Matt Brown?
June, we were talking about progressive energy earlier. Right. What do you think right now as the Matt Brown challenge continues?
Well, his message certainly lines up very closely with the progressive agenda. However, the campaign is just starting. Now, he is working very hard. I was at a Women's Fund gubernatorial forum where neither female candidate showed up, but Brown announced to the group that he was doing 34 events in 30 days. So he's clearly getting out there, working hard, and he can make up for that deficit, that name recognition deficit. She, on the other hand, has a lot of money and has run a successful gubernatorial campaign before in this state. The National Governors Association is now running harsh ads. The Republican National Governors Association is running harsh ads against her. So she does have a challenge here, that's for sure. But I think she's got also a very strong organization and some significant support around the state.
The thing about Matt Brown that's interesting though is he's already done all of this before, right? So he's not going to have the slip-ups of a new campaign, and so he comes in and he's done Secretary of State. He briefly did the Senate, so he knows what it takes. 34 events in 30 days. He knows how to gain momentum, put out the big announcements, try to do that. So the one thing I wonder about Matt Brown though is it too early? Is he just right now like putting out lots of information and getting the people who were likely to support him? But is he actually going to be there 2 months from now when the average voter starts paying attention to the race?
And we have a Republican primary too. Alan Fung, Patricia Morgan, Giovanni Feroci. As always, the Republicans, there's never quite as much oxygen around there because the party is numerically smaller in Rhode Island. Alan Fung's still widely seen as the front runner in that race. How does that one look to you right now, Ian?
Well, Fung has advantages in name recognition and money. The Republican establishment seems to be behind him. Morgan will tell us when we ask how she overcomes this that she has better ideas, but she doesn't have as much money. She's not as well known. The question is whether the issues that you and Tim White have reported on with the Carpionato issue, does that give Morgan a toehold to build her support? But time's running short. The primary is just a couple of months away, and the question is whether she can really boost her support.
And it's been interesting because the final week of the legislative session, getting a lot of TV time, and it's been
Patricia
notable,
Morgan,
and people within her own caucus as well as across the aisle have been poking her quite a bit for her floor speeches in the last week, because they think she's trying to kind of take one last bit of
a version
TV
of the
time.
advantage of incumbency there.
Smart politics,
Patricia Morgan,
right? Pretty smart
speaking up.
calls.
Dan, only about a minute left, but I have to ask you something we've been following. It sounds esoteric, but it's super important. This effort to sell the Providence, or to monetize the Providence water supply to bail out the pension system. Where does that stand?
So it's going nowhere this year, and it's a bill that this has been thrown out for years and years and years. And the Mayor Lorza has really tried to focus on it. It's not going anywhere this year. The mayor doesn't have a lot of support, even within supporters on his council. So it's going to be hard to get done. But he says, "I'll be back next year, and I'll be back the next year after that if you don't get it done then."
All right. Well, it sounds like that debate is not going away, nor is Political Roundtable, because it's an election season. Thank you, June Speakman, John Marion, Dan McGowan, Ian Donnis, for joining me. Again, I'm Ted Nisi. I've been filling in for Tim White. He should be back next week, but that all depends on the fate of Cadillac Frank Salemi in Boston. So you can follow Tim's coverage of the mob trial on WPRI.com. We'll see you back here next week on Newsmakers.